Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to each and every one of you. Welcome to the first of our schedule of lectures for 2025. You know, what can I say? Look at the size of this audience. It's very gratifying to have such a wonderful, intelligent audience, but such a sizable audience, especially for our first lecture. Tonight's lecture, as always, is co-hosted between the Royal Society Te Aotearoa and ourselves, the Royal Society Museum Wellington branch. And of course, this is the beautiful Aotearoa Lecture Theatre that we're enjoying yet again, slap bang in the middle of the Royal Society Te Aotearoa campus. So I guess because it's a co-hosting arrangement, it's my pleasure, and it falls to me, of course, to welcome each and every one of you on behalf of both organisations, the Royal Society Te Aotearoa and the Royal Society Museum Wellington branch. Now look, I don't see any need to foreshadow anything about Len's lecture. I'm sure that Len is well capable of foreshadowing his own lecture. But what I will do though is to read very briefly a plotted biography that he's provided. Some of you will have seen it, but I think it's a good way of setting the scene. Okay, now, Len Cook. Bruce is the person who is recording. Len became government statistician of New Zealand, and he was the government statistician between 1992 and 2000. From 2000 to 2005, he was National Statistician of the United Kingdom and Registrar General of England and Wales. He joined the Department of Statistics after graduating in Mathematics and Statistics from Otago University in 1971. And he is today a companion of the Royal Society Te Aotearoa. Past appointments include Commissioner at the Royal Commission on Social Policy, 1987 and 1988, member of the Secretariat of the Task Force on Tax Reform in 1981, chair of the Medical Training Board, 2007 to 2009, chair of the Board and Families Commissioner, Superu/Families Commission, 2015 to 2018, and research associate since 2006 at Te Nira at the University of Waikato. His continuing interests are in the areas of population change and public policy, public administration, retirement provision, imprisonment patterns, official statistics generally, and the place of science in policy. His personal interests include fly fishing. Now, it's my pleasure to sit down and see the ground to Len Cook.
Well, thank you, George. Thanks for that. This talk is really primarily based on what I describe as a population storm, but the timing of it is really because, as many of you, when you read the newspapers, we have proposals that we actually won't have a future census in the form that we've known since the 1850s, and it will be dealt with, produced by the administrative records that the Crown gathers from your connections with social welfare, tax, police, health and other agencies. I want to raise that as a bit of an issue because I think it means that the inevitability of the huge population changes I'm going to talk about mean that I'm not sure that we can afford to risk having a third failure with our population statistics. And the changes I'm going to talk about, I think, are probably more substantial than you might have appreciated. They're going to test significantly the fiscal capability of the government, and I'm going to give you some indication of the scale of that. But my fundamental point is that the users of statistics in New Zealand are really poorly disorganised to oversee the statistics that we produce. They don't really challenge the statistician enough. They need to. They don't group, and so when the government statistician in 2015 got rid of all of their user groups and stopped having 5-yearly user conferences, there was very little reaction from the user community. And can I make the point, when I was in Britain, if we made a minor change to a statistic, I'd have 4 people banging on my door, explaining in the most minute detail. Whereas I think New Zealanders just don't invest enough in what is one of the most important resources. I think that some of that we've seen a dilution in statistical reporting, not only by the government statistician, but also by public institutions. I don't know whether you last found a nice hard copy publication. You had to work through one of the world country's most difficult websites to find out what you want. We've actually got, at a critical period of population change, we actually know that the value of the decisions made on our census data are about 100 times the cost of a census over the 5-year period. If you think about 200 billion on infrastructure investment alone. So we really need to think about that. And I guess my final point is that we can't just deal with population change having one group talk about retirement provision, another lot talking about aged care homes, someone else talking about access to education. We need to realise that we're going to have to make massive trade-offs in the future. So we need to think through, actually, do we have a population policy or not? The last one we had was, would you believe, 1990? It was called the human face. It's bloody wrinkled by now. But I actually chaired it when I was young. One thing I want to do is talk just briefly about how I believe that failure of the 2018 census still shapes our decisions. And I think it's important to recognise that each successive census tells us more about who we're becoming and how the places where we live are changing. So at each census, the whole series of them is very much forward-looking. The population statistics we have are really our most significant bits of knowledge about our future situation. It's partly, we have this wonderful group of people called demographers who are able to analyse, to model the population ahead from the information we've got. I think one of the problems we had the deviation from what I would call trusted practices in 2018 to 23 occurred when it's become actually increasingly important that we integrate other statistics about place into our population knowledge. We need to know much more about environmental changes. We've got huge shifts in land use. If you think about it, in 1976, we had 76 million sheep. We've now got 22 million. And if you think of the massive shift in land use, we've got forests in some places. We've got cows producing milk in other places. We've turned potato fields into old folks' homes. And so we're seeing an incredibly massive shift. I mean, my partner comes from around Milton, and in the basin that her father had a farm in where there were 13 farms, sheep farms, there's now only 3, the rest are pine trees. I'm not sure what that will do. They're just lucky in Milton they put a prison there. So I think one of our problems is the census in 2023 was planned without us really properly assessing what went wrong in 2018. And that's my point. And so the opportunity cost of inadequately reviewing the 2018 census was that we had 6 years without providing a quality address frame for the surveys and censuses that we run in the future, including the 2023 census. And also we lost the opportunity to begin more rapidly integrating data from other sources, administrative and otherwise, into our population data. I was in Ottawa about a year and a half ago, just after fires in British Columbia were causing people in New York to have face masks. So if you think about the sort of data that we need to bring integrating, we also know from the work of Natalie Jackson, one of our leading demographers, that the analysis that she produced 10 to 15 years ago, that each of New Zealand's 78 local authorities would ultimately end up be moving in an entirely different and unique way compared to the rest, has actually been demonstrated from the last 10 years of data from the 2023 census. And so no longer, as we could during the post-war baby boom decades, when I came along, actually almost take the national population distributions and assert that pretty much every place looked roughly the same. Now we've got 78 distinct populations in New Zealand, and we need to think about that. We also overspent. We spent 150 extra million on the 2023 census. In real terms, it was 2.1 times what we spent in the earlier one, and each of the ones in the 100 years before. Now, I can assure you that if the Ministers of Finance I had to deal with, Ruth Richardson, Bill Birch, and Gordon Brown, if I had said to him, mate, I've just doubled the money we had to spend on that, never done it before in 100 years, he would have had my guts for gators. Now, where was Grant Robertson and where was Nicola Willis? I haven't heard a peep out of any of them. So normally, if you doubled the amount of money you spend on something, I can assure you, at least in the good old days, Ministers of Finance would have been deeply worried. Right now, we've got a new lot of ministers being asked to agree yet again sometime in the next month on another possibly poorly tested census proposals, we don't know because we're not allowed to see the background papers, that will affect pretty much every spending decision that ministers make over the coming decade. Now, my comment is that New Zealand scientists have yet to give ministers the assurance they require, and so must urgently establish a properly independent assessment of the proposed census methodology led by the Royal Society. So, in my view, the Royal Society, hopefully ministers will ask them at some stage, because after all, the government statistician is one of our most trusted public officials, and therefore if you want to challenge one of our most trusted public officials, you have to go to the scientific organisation with the most mana in New Zealand, which is of course the Royal Society. And we can't be sure, if we can't be sure that the census plan in 2028 will work, let's delay the damn thing till 21. So anyway, it's just a couple of extra thoughts I had. Just use, before I get into the rest of it, it's useful to think of what do we actually use population statistics for? And in a way, they're about the trust of citizens in the constitutional integrity of the state. They enable us to hold government to account in terms of what is happening to population. What is the age of eligibility for retirement provision? What are we doing with families? They enable confidence in the quality of political decision making and trust. I do put my tongue in cheek a bit there. And in the institutions of society. And so, for example, when Treasury tells us what our long-term fiscal outlook is, we have a trust in it because it's based in good quality information by highly competent public officials. We also empower communities by reporting on the populations and have them knowing who their populations are. And this is true for ethnic, religious communities. Even in the existence of privacy, those communities want to know who they are. So that knowledge of communities is tremendously important. And we also, of course, establish up-to-date, trustworthy electoral districts and population-based resource allocation. And I would argue that New Zealand's electoral boundary setting processes, done every 5 years after the census, are amongst the most trustworthy in the world. We haven't had the gerrymandering that our Australian friends have had 100 years ago, admittedly, or with Bjelke Peterson. But when we have every census, the government statistician and the Surveyor General comes up with a draft which then political parties haggle over and accompanied of a judge. I think most countries don't have anything as effective as that. On behalf of citizens, we know the condition and dynamics of society, of communities. We can look ahead, decade, generation by generation, and people can make long-term plans based on some confidence. I think that what I think we're at risk of, if we fly blind into this population storm I'm going to outline, one thing about a population policy, it can force us to think about a range of policies at the same time, which is not what we're really good at. And those reasons are simply what is unprecedented. One is that our fertility rates have declined such that in every age group, for the last 12 years, our fertility rates have been lower than we've seen before. In fact, it's interesting, we're now at a stage where a female set 15 to 19 has got a lower chance of having a child than a woman 40 to 45. Imagine what Walker would have said if he had known that. That's quite an extraordinary shift. I have to admit that for, of course, individual families this happened. My mother, whose last child was born in 1960 and who reached the age of 60 in 1977 and qualified for Mr Muldoon's superannuation scheme, actually had the rare opportunity of being a recipient of an age benefit and a family benefit at the same time. So in terms of, shall we say, anecdotal understanding of demographic challenges, our family certainly has got some good examples. So what I make the point is, also what we're seeing is a huge shift in the ethnic mix of the population and its scale, and I'll talk about that. But I think what the fundamental point I want to make is that what characterised the population structures and dynamics of our population up to 20 years ago isn't relevant now, and it won't be relevant in 20 years' time. And that's one of the things I want to show you. And therefore we need to be really quite concerned about this. And these structural effects, we're already starting to see them. We're seeing people debating about how we're going to look after people in aged care. We've got 43,000 people in aged care homes now. We employ about 14,000 people for them. If we double that number, where do we get the 14,000 extra workers from? And secondly, have we got the fiscal capability of supporting that 43,000 in the current way that we're doing? I think that what I want to do is just talk about the central themes of those knowledge gaps. One is place, and this is a central thrust of my talk overall, that knowledge about locality is an important gap in population statistics we have to shift through. And the most obvious example, 200 billion in infrastructure investment in the next 20 years. As someone from the Infrastructure Commission pointed out to me, if we misdirect 25 or 30 billion of that, and we only put 170 in the right place, we've still got to pay for the whole 200. So we need to think about that as being quite a vital concern to us. We've got a high variability in population change among localities. We've got some places in the Waitaki Valley, for example, 40 years ago, when it was full of sheep farms, and young men like Richie McCaw left town, there were about 25 kids at the local school. Now you've got a school of over about 120 because those sheep farms have become dairy farms and there's a large number of Filipino families that service them. Now who was going to predict that 40 years ago? And I think just about every part of the country. I read yesterday in the paper, as we will have known for the last few months, Aotearoa is going to see a large loss of people of working age population. And already, in terms of the now cheaper houses in Aotearoa, are a whole lot of people of near retirement age who realise their incomes are going to be sufficiently low that they need to live somewhere where there's cheap housing and that their incomes will survive. So the dynamics of population change are almost specific to each locality. In fact, the Chinese already recognise this now, in that their population projections, when they produce them, they're based on about 35 distinct communities and areas in China with distinct economies, and they're able to produce effective population. And I think our wee country could probably do the same. I mentioned about the dynamics of the need to understand the connection between market and non-market productivity. If we're going to have a massive decline in our taxable capacity, then we need to think about what is the non-market contribution for people in the economy. Now, one non-market contribution, when as a child born in 49, when I went to school, class sizes moved up from 30 to 40. And it wasn't unusual to find that there were more than 40 kids in your class, and we survived. So there's a whole lot of adaptation mechanisms that are not market-based that actually where a society will respond, and we need to understand that quite significantly. We've also got a share of the total population available for critical occupations. We're already hearing about the police, military, truck drivers. My father was a truck driver. He'd be delighted to know how scarce truck drivers are now. Probably wouldn't have influenced their pay, unfortunately. But anyway, the nursing, we have moments when we've got too many and moments we haven't got enough. We're also seeing an unrealised potential yet from the uplift in Maori and Pacific educational outcomes. We know that Maori and Pacific populations tend to concentrate in areas where actually we haven't invested as well in educational, health and other facilities. And maybe we have to think about that a bit more seriously. One of our adaptation mechanisms is that the labour force participation of people 65 and over is actually between 65 and 75 is about the second highest in the OECD. One of the ironies, I should say, is when National Super came in 1977, it may surprise you, but for the next 10 years, the labour force participation of men and women between 60 and 65 actually fell. Possibly one would say that was because of the remarkable generosity of Rob Muldoon, although I'm sure even now he won't be given the credit for that. I think, can I talk about intergenerational patterns? The Maori age distribution now is the same as the European age distribution in 1966. It's 40% of the size now that the European population was in 66. Now, if you think about 66 was one of the peak areas of demographic dynamism of the European population. So we have a Maori population now that has reached a scale and has a demographic structure and potential dynamism, which is something that we're no longer going to see in the European population. And how we actually get the full benefit of that is something we don't seem to make a big issue yet. I'll talk a little bit, this is just getting into some exciting statistics. This is just my chart of fertility rates going back, and you can see the last 15 years that in every age group we've got a decline. This is 15 to 19, as I say, I think this is around. This is where Bert Walker, who was Minister of Social Welfare, wanted us to get rid of the DPP because it was encouraging excessive sexual activity in young girls. Because they didn't have the downstream impact. But you can see this, well, the dynamics of that, the impact on that of our population in various ways is quite significant. If we look at survivorship, this year at age 80, well, the dark blue is people born in 1921, and the yellow is people born in 1951. Well, the blue there is my old mother. The yellow is me, so you can see I've now got over twice the chance of my mother of living to 80. And we're seeing that right through, the chance of getting right. So we're going to have to start soon thinking about not only policies as we've had for years of people over 65, but 75 to 85, 85 to 90. We're going to have to start grouping our thinking and policy of how we deal with different population groups. And we're very clearly not well equipped for that, except statistically. Now, if we lost this, that you can produce this type of analysis because you've got 100 years of population censuses. If you lost that concept and relied solely on administrative data, it's not clear to me yet. And what I can tell you is that New Zealand's demographic community will probably leave the country. Just a little bit of migration. Since for the last 20 years, migration has changed massively in New Zealand. We had a long-term average net flow of a bit over 20,000 in this black line here of people coming in and out. Now that has shifted quite dramatically. So this has a huge impact, and not universally across the country, but in different parts. And then this here is just the net impact on the population as a whole. And you can see in these periods here, the net migrant, full-time permanent migrant flow has been more than doubled that the impact on the net annual growth, the natural increase. So the natural increase is this green line. And so how we actually make projections of that in particular places is obviously nothing short of a miracle. So again, we've added volatility, and that volatility is not evenly spread around the country. This is just showing the impact, net impact. You can see the blue line there. You can see since 1960, 59, we started having about 60,000 babies a year. And Stats New Zealand tell us their projections will still have about 60,000 babies a year in 110 years later. And of course, what's happening is that the population, as it is living longer, you can see in that chart that the red line crosses the yellow line in about 10 years' time, so that the population 75 and over will exceed that, 65 to 74. It's usually we make that cut off because by the time you get to people in their 80s, their average house costs are about twice that of New Zealand super. So it's thinking through that the blue, the black and the purple line gives you an indication of the aging of our workforce. And that chart it's a bit less stable, partly because of the impact of immigration flows. So that has quite an impact on that. This is an interesting chart. The light blue there, and that is 50, tells you the share of the population in that 10-year period, the growth that's 75 and over. And what this is telling us, for the next 20 years, 45% of the population growth in New Zealand will be people 75 and over. It's quite a somewhat interesting figure. I mean, when you reach that age yourself, of course, it doesn't seem so bad. In fact, you start to wonder, well, where are all those old people gone? But this is a massive shift in our population thinking. And of course, if you look at Maori and Pacific societies, it's not mirrored in that at all. Although the growth in people over 60, the growth rates are as high, but they're from a very low base. So our society is shifting quite massively in respect to ageing. This, you just come back to the Maori age distribution I talked about. This is the share, the non-Maori share in each group, and the European share in 66, and the Maori is at 2023, and this is the share of the population, 40%, that is Maori now compared to the 1966 European population. And there's be a very similar chart if I looked at the Pacific population. And of course, one of the things that means is that, so for example, someone like me who went to university in 1970, if you looked at many of the professions at that time, I know in statistics there may have been 1 or 2 Maori, there may have been 1 or 2 people in law, different fields. Now, in almost all of those fields, there are sufficient Maori to create a critical mass of expertise in the specific field. But I'm not sure we've cottoned on to that either. Just a little bit of this is really updates work that Natalie Jackson did. And this gives you an idea, if you look at, this is our territorial local authorities. I've merely ranked them by size of the difference between the number of leaving the workforce and the number joining at the workforce age. So this lot here actually has more people coming into the workforce than aging out. All of these other local authorities, they have got people aging out of the workforce at a great rate. Waitemata here has clearly got some challenges. And so each of this gives you an idea of the scale of change that's going on around New Zealand. And how if we lose that ability to understand what's going on locally, we're going to be making some fairly crude, unwise decisions in resource allocation. And you imagine if you're the Infrastructure Commission now wondering about where are you going to put your pipes and dams and line, electricity generation, electricity lines. This is a huge challenge. Just a little bit of some of these things. If you think about the politics of shifting things, how on earth, I mean, for example, if President Trump is quite right and we don't need Comelco, for a long time we've given them cheap electricity because no government's been prepared to front up to do something that might cost 300 or 400 Invercargilites their jobs. But they're going to age out of the population at some stage. We've got huge issues of loss of post offices without thinking about it. So these are just the areas where, in fact, this is key infrastructure that affects the population that we need to be more effective in mapping to where the population changes are actually happening. This is one of my favourite charts. This is Papakura. And this is me selecting the most volatile 10-year change in New Zealand that I could find. So this gives you this is an extreme. And what you can see there is in 2013, compared to 23, there's roughly the same number of European people in Papakura. When it comes to Asian population, it went from 5,500 to 24,500. And the Pacific population, 6,000 to nearly 15, and the Maori from 12 to 18. Now, if you were planning schools, medical services, houses in Papakura, would you really know what to do in 2012? If you were designing roads, if you're even working out where to put the sewers. So this gives you an idea of the potential shift, that we won't see this shift at a scale in many other places, but this is an actual example of the scale of shift that we can get locally. What I've got here is a special Cook index of fiscal pressure. I've drawn on some Treasury fiscal incident study, but Treasury should not be blamed for these calculations. Really, imagine it's a thermometer. And what it's really saying is that in 1991, the position we were in then, this is just an index, so that's the base. It may be good or bad. And what we're saying is that up to 2011, we basically seem to have some fiscal balance between the earnings of people in the workforce and the welfare payments and education payments and health payments that we made to the population. And then round about 2011, it started to get a bit tighter, which is probably why we've now got ministers wanting to do things. And by the time you get to 2046, in fact you get there by about 2035, we have about 35% less fiscal capability. Now we're either going to increase taxes, we're going to educate the workforce, so we're all going to become highly productive, more productive. Just changing our statistics won't help. So this is where, in many of those things that we need to do, we'll have a long lag period. And unless we start confronting the fact that this is the path that we're on, that comes out of our age structure and the way it's changing, then we'll be rather slow at reacting. And what we know is that our political system, while we've got a very intellectual, boundary setting system, it doesn't necessarily mean we get the wisest politicians, although we hope it can. And so our political system, where politicians tend to like for quick fix 5-year solutions, we need to somehow or other, really over the next few years, almost have a 20-year horizon for policies and their implications. And clearly the last thing we can afford to do is put in place policies that we have to reverse 3 or 4 years later when a government changes, or when a new minister. You can actually have a different minister in the same party and they want to change it, apparently. Maybe I won't read too much. Just a little bit, just some comments now. The weaknesses in public management really are in all infrastructure, including official statistics. We have this wonderful political preference for decisiveness, as long as it's justified by a slogan, myth or anecdote. I guess school lunches are just a beautiful example of that, aren't they? My kid's had his tongue burnt out, but actually it was going to be good. Parliamentary competence in overseeing official statistics, in my view, is not strong. I mean, in the 2023 census, we got an 88% response rate, and the then Minister of Statistics, Deborah Russell, told 150 people at the 2023 population conference that that result was excellent. Well, it wouldn't be excellent anywhere else in the world or anywhere in New Zealand before then. But so, and I sometimes think that politicians shouldn't act like judges of methodological issues unless they they just demean themselves. So that was a pretty stupid statement. It wasn't helped, however, by the fact that the government's target, which they've never ever given a census before, the government only needed to get 90% in the census. Now, I don't know about you, but if you're ever been told you only need to do 90% of what you have to do, who decides on the 90%? It's a pretty silly idea, I think. We've got weakened governance of scientific capability and statistical roles across government. Weak accountability. Weak accountability actually leaves little reservoir of trust when calamities occur. I can assure you, from my experience, the best way of retaining trust when you've had a major blunder is to be quite open with the blunder. In fact, the ideal is if you're the one that tells people what the blunder is. And you then just cheekily get to define what the blunder is. If you're not very good at telling people, you'll always have another 100 people offering better advice on what the blunder is than you. So a good Sir Humphrey, and we tend to lack them in the New Zealand government, unfortunately, is actually not only good at doing the job, but has got certain skills at knowing how to manage a blunder in a way where you can still keep a straight face. We've got weak systemic oversight of transformation initiatives. It seems to me that the less you know about an agency, the more you want to transform it. And whereas good old quality assurance, all of you, I'm sure, George there is an expert on it, will know all about Edward Deming and his wonderful phrase, management by walking around. Just sniffing the place, seeing how it smells. Well, information is quite important. In the end, there are some things that are not negotiable. International trust in our statistics is important. I still remember in '93 when we doubled the balance of payments one month, and 6 months later we halved it back to where it was. And we did that the week before Ruth Richardson was off to Standard & Poor's and Moody's, New York, to justify our credit rating. And she called me up for a meeting. And I got what you might call a bottom spanking. Because her argument was, how can I convince these people that determine our credit rating that the statistics that it's based on are not spongy? Why should they believe them? And I must admit, I kept that conversation with me for the rest of my career. Because it's when you're normally producing statistics, you don't think of Standard & Poor's and Moody's. But in fact, there are some elements, the UN benchmarks on human rights, for example, who are constitutional determinants of electoral boundaries. People have to believe them. Obviously, Aotearoa has got some interesting challenges now. And long-term fiscal forecasts, which actually massively influence what government's going to do. And so I think that it's not only the marginal use of a statistic which is really important, and as I made the point that actually official statisticians know really very little about how people use their data. Every time in my life I've been responsible for cancelling a statistic, I've generally found that the response of people who have lost it has been massively greater than anything that we knew about what the statistics were being used for. Now this is a wee bit, when I mentioned that this 2018 was a disaster, what I did here is I took the 2020 and 13 enumerator instruction book and mapped it against what we did in 2018. Now these are the things that enumerator does. The first thing they do, well firstly, by the way, you get a list of addresses from somewhere, lands and survey or the post office. Obviously the post office is getting worse and worse at that, so you know that it's going downhill. You match the addresses to the districts, then the enumerator goes around well before the census and does their own enumeration of every dwelling, every place where people can live. They then actually contact that place and they make at least 3 visits to drop off forms. So they're there. Then forms are either completed by post, and if they're not, and usually it's a very quick response from the central system, we've received their forms. If you haven't got them, then you keep calling back. You then have a sample check of the enumerator supervisor will look at about 1 in 200, 1 in 150 places, and we'll go back and say, oh, there's Philippa, have you filled in did someone come and get your form, Philippa? And Philippa might say yes, and you take it off, or she says no, then someone will have a black market and someone will find out what went on. You then also have census night enumerate, because the aim of a census is to ensure that on census night, every place where people gather, live or whatever, has census forms. That's the aim. So by census night. So we actually have people on picket ferries overnight. In 1976, I had 4 sailings in a row on one of the Picton ferries, hassling everyone with their census forms. When we used to have overnight trains, we would have someone on the overnight train. And so the aim is at night, you're really focusing on that. And then, of course, the other thing that we did is after 1986, we took over the enumeration from the post office, and we saved 25% of the budget, by the way, because we no longer pay post office officials a triple time for doing the census. We actually found that after 86, half the enumerators were people who had done it before. So we actually had a whole pool of people. Now, in 2018, we did none of this. And we made the assumption that our address list was fine. The external review said actually it wasn't. And they then ended up, however, the external review panel completely failed to do any of this sort of analysis. They decided that because people didn't like filling in their Wi-Fi codes, that was the main reason we didn't get a response. Yet we know that 1 in 7 households never received contact by the department. 1 in 7. Now I would argue that what one should have done is pulled this bits and said, well, let's get a decent address register, and we didn't. So in 2023, even more strongly than last time, the address register of the census was totally wrong. And my argument there is we've lost 6 years when we could have lifted our game with an address register, probably had a much better census. It just gives you an idea of how not really strongly analysing the faults that you've got can lead you down a challenging path. My colleagues in stats probably don't agree with me, but then again, they're wiser, but I'm a bit cheekier. Just a little bit, this issue of the asset value being weekly revealed, if the users don't know what they want, or don't convey what they want it for, and the producers don't really know what people do with their data, then we surely have a little bit of a problem that we need to think about. And this is true every statistical office in the world. For example, just give you a little example, you might have expert advisory bodies. You know, bring all your economic experts together every few months. Population experts, as we used to do until 2015. We used to have a Maori Statistics Forum chaired by Manu Bishop Bennett with people like Mason Jury, etc., Heke Parata on it. So you have that, you recognise that constitutional position of Māori, bringing top class people together. You recognise the importance of expert. There's nothing worse. You know, I can assure you, if you've been told off by Brian Easton or Ian Paul, you do go away feeling a little bit chastised, but you also know that these are people who, in their heart, actually want you to run a bloody good statistic system. And so, and I think that's something that my sense is that in the New Zealand public sector, we're all becoming a bit lily-livered and not wanting to be told off. But in fact, you know, some of the best experiences that you can have are being done over by someone much brighter than you, I believe. We could have a national population policy. We could have much better oversight arrangements. For example, when I left the United Kingdom, the new legislation the government was planning had a statistics authority of about 6 leading citizens who not only challenged the statistical office, but also challenged, at one time they challenged the Prime Minister on how he used data. Boris Johnson got given heaps by the chair of the statistics authority for his bus, a Brexit bus, on National Health Service costs. Now, even those gutsy government statistician would have some reluctance telling a Prime Minister off. I've got a quote from Bolger when he said it's not true that I said Mr. Cook cooked the books. We've got this. The other thing is the Centre for Population Reporting and Analysis, and in Australia, the Treasury has a population centre jointly with the Australian Bureau of Statistics. We could encourage public sector and university collaboration. We've got some excellent universities that are, of course, slowly diminishing their capability in geography, demography, and social science in the last few years. But we've got a very strong demographic centre at Waikato. We could seek the voice of citizens. The 75 Stats Act, not the current one, requires the government statistician to have a 5-yearly conference of users of statistics and producers. And I still remember the nervousness of John Darwin when we had the first one in 1980, and it went really well. And we can actually also improve the dissemination of statistics. We may not ever be able to reproduce the yearbook, but we can certainly have far better reporting of population, demographic and other trends. Just a wee bit that I think people have to take interest, because the opportunity costs of not doing it are borne by taxpayers and the consumers of services who are not generally in a position to argue and challenge. Just a little, these are the assertions that have been made that I challenge. And this is, one is that it'd be too costly to have a normal census. Well, my argument is it'll be too costly to have one if you did it the way you did it last time, but no one should ever do it that way. We should just go back to how we used to do it, right through from the 1850s to 2013. Secondly, the public won't support future censuses. Well, I think we have to be careful about blaming the public when the public sector can't do its job properly. You know, I think blaming the public is something that, you know, it's an easy thing to do in Molesworth Street, but it's a bit more difficult when you're actually out there. Other countries are moving in the same direction. Well, that's rot. In fact, the Australians, Canadians, Americans and the British have all invested in the last 10 years heavily in lifting their address rates. So they have moved to, and they're all getting response rates in their censuses 95% or above. So they actually realise that's the direction to go. The British, the Canadians, Americans, Australians, also their census is an integral part of their constitution. So they're not going to change it overnight. The British, like us, don't have a constitution. And the British, on one hand, would like to do what the New Zealand proposal is, but at the end, 6 weeks ago, at a conference in London of the Royal Statistical Society, the then British statistician couldn't say what we're going to do in Britain in 2031. He's actually got a collection of people who are in Britain slightly more vociferous, and we are unconcerned. So I think whatever happens in Britain will be a bit of a challenge. But there is no way that you can say other countries are moving in the same direction if you actually do any state. In fact, one of the papers to ministers that I've seen talked about the 5-yearly British census. Well, can I tell you the British have never had a 5-yearly census? Not since 1801. And so it gives you an idea that when you're making international comparisons, you need to make sure where you're getting your information from. The new household, the ID information obtained from Minister of Records can meet needs. Well, the IDI is just a wonderful source of information, but it is a history of your connections with a collection of government agencies pulled together. One of my economist friends describes them as fossils, and that you can't change them, you don't determine the content. And the only problem is, unlike some fossils, we can't have a skeleton to them. Because, of course, in statistics, the skeleton are the international standards for frame definition, classifications, classifications and standards. They don't apply to administrative data. No government department in New Zealand uses the same classification for the same variable yet. And so if you want to mix them together, you do have to do a little bit of, I think we call it shoehorning. The new household surveys can mean lost information. Well, look, if we're not able to get the response rates in the census, and I mind you, the Americans every year have an American community survey, 5% of households, and they get a response rate of over 85% since COVID. So I would argue that both New Zealand and Britain need to invest more in convincing the public they should fill in forms. And what I do know is after every census, except the last two, there's always a massive lift in survey response rates, because all that wonderful publicity, what I would call a free state-paid loss leader for survey taking, convinces people of the value of information. And so normally, for example, in '96, the labour force survey response rates went up to 92%, and the household budget survey went to just over 80%. And they'd been about 3 or 4% below that before that census. And that's just the value of just blasting the public for 3 weeks, taking over the airwaves, having people everywhere, talking about the census. There may be another pandemic as one argument. My answer to that is, so what? I was responsible for running a British census in the middle of a foot and mouth epidemic. We coped, and we've had cyclones here. Is Stats New Zealand adequately cited on user needs? I would say no statistical office in the world is. And I can assure you that is the case. And so if my friends in Stats New Zealand say they are adequately cited, then they do need to tell us why they are unique among statistical offices. I know that they're unique, I know they're a great office, but it's not time for me to rabbit on about that. If having made 2 major mistakes, don't you have to do more than you would ordinarily do to tell us you're going to get this right? At least I think so. Having had my own bottom spanked for things, I can assure you that's normally the practice. And finally, I think you need due diligence of the changes. And due diligence is really important, and that's why I make the point about the importance of the Royal Society being a place where we can have due diligence on a scientific basis. And that's my final comment.
Well, thank you, Len, so much for a gripping talk. Look, we have about 15 or 20 minutes, so people will put their hands up, and I'll take the microphone around. You didn't say much about current thinking that some ministers are considering ceasing collection of the population census. Any comments about that?
I think the government statistician has indicated on quite a few occasions that's what would like to be done, and the previous minister, Andrew Bailey, was very clear in his first few weeks in the job that that's what he wanted to see. We've heard nothing as yet from Dr. Retty.
Yeah, because you and I had a very quick exchange on prior to the terminations of censuses and what they have done. I mentioned the agricultural statistics,
Yes.
which was ceased by Lockwood Smith, if I remember correctly, in 1996. So it was deemed to be too expensive to collect information on agricultural production and land use. 4 or 5 years later, we can't, engage in trade negotiations or forward planning. We don't know what's happening to land use. Now we reinstate it, but the problem is that the frame gets degraded, and meanwhile you get new farms who are not on the frame, farms go out of business, or they change ownership and so forth, and the problems in reinstating are enormous. But you mentioned another one back in 1991, was it?
The actual annual agriculture census went then, as did a few other.
But it went again in 1996.
Yes, yeah. I think it became a sample after 91. It was a full census in 91, and then it became a sample, and I think that then changed.
And now it's 5 yearly censuses with sample surveys of particular activities in the meanwhile, whether it's grain arable cropping or pip fruit or sheep and beef or cattle or for dairy and so forth.
And I think the frame is now based on tax the business register, which is based on tax returns.
Oh, I see. Okay, not on farm income.
Well, they would get that.
Yeah, that would give you the same thing. Okay, so hands up, please. Yes.
Kia ora, thank you very much, Len. So would you take the census back offline? We go back to the ritual I actually think Kiwis enjoyed of census night. You sit down and you fill out your bits of paper and you have much more interaction with actually human beings to make it happen.
I think you need to give people the option if they want to. Clearly there are generational differences in people's attitudes and their comfort. I still ask for the bilingual paper form, just to encourage people to keep it. But you know, I think the paper form gives you a wonderful way of tracking it, and I think we have got better at tracking. The key thing that we needed to know, which we were better at in 23, is what's actually the flow of forms coming back, so you know where you're not getting them.
Yeah, who got the hand up first? Is somebody in the front row, second row? And then I'll go further back.
I can't read this. One question is access to internet. Okay, that should be a very important issue now. It's okay if you have unlimited data, $60 a month, but if you're poverty, you don't have any access to internet. That's a problem. Another one is generations and social, and the calendar with all kinds of months, which are, you can't organise 1 month ahead with the calendar.
In terms of internet, can I say, I think one of the things we've lost with paper publications is that wonderful collection of reports that you could get at easily in a public library. You know, the best university in New Zealand, I think, is Waikato, dare I say, with its history, but places like university and all public libraries would have shelves of publications beautifully organised, and by not having the publications, one of the real difficulties with the website is it's difficult to find what you got last month. And I think we still haven't developed probably needs a good librarian or someone to think about, or someone who's, no. So I think we haven't yet created a web presence for statistics that has got any of the innate qualities of a shelf of books.
Kia ora, Len. Firstly, great talk. So, my goodness, I have been in the area of statistics for about the last 10 years, and arguably I probably learned just as much about statistics during my PhD in public health than I had even with a master's in statistics. How do we educate our younger statisticians about how they use statistics, and particularly the threat to statistics as we know it in New Zealand with the loss of the census?
I must admit, it's a bit late for me to be retrospectively wise, but I was like, I did, for example, economics with my statistics. That got me into time series analysis, so I spent the first 10 years of my working life, a fair portion of it in the Treasury, and got involved a lot in spread into things like taxation. And I think that a good statistics degree now would cover, for example, a lot more geography. And I think we need to think through, in developing statisticians, what are the other subjects that give you a leg in quite early on in your career and have some real value. And I think that's that sense of what are the mix of things you need as a statistician, because it's really hard if your skill is virtually only statistics to get people wanting to come and rush to talk to you. If you've got a bridging capacity, then you've got much more value in my view. But as I say, I'm possibly a little bit out of date.
Kia ora, Mr. Cook. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting as a layperson with no background in statistics or maths. But I was particularly curious because you mentioned that there is quite a big gap between the data collectors and the data users. And I was interested in what you, other than the the ceasing of the user conferences, what other things you think might contribute to that gap and what could contribute to closing the gap?
Right. I think that it's obviously going to have to change over time. But for example, many years ago, when there was a task force by Jeff Todd on retirement provision in 91, and we knew there was going to be another one. In 91, they did some really innovative things for government, and then they came along in 96, and they basically still had the same information base. So I said to him, look, if you want to help statisticians, we're reactors. We react to what people want. We're not necessarily able to think what the response would be. And so he produced for the first time in any review a whole chapter on how this review would have been done better if we'd had these statistics. Now out of that, by 2001, we had a wealth survey, a longitudinal income survey, and a collection of other things. And so I think when you carry out a review of an area or study, the onus is on you to actually say, well, look, I'd have done it better if I had more statistics. These are what I need. And you can't rely on government statisticians to be social foreseers of social change and what's needed. You know, when you know what you want, their job is to think of the mechanics, the processes, the future tools. But in terms of what you want the information for, you have to find ways. This other mix of things I put on, like actually having really strong user groups. I think the professional societies are failing in their duty. For example, the Royal Statistical Society actually runs its own user group. Our Statistical Association doesn't. The Population Association could be more vigorous. The Association of Economists could be more vigorous. The geographers could be more vigorous. You know, our professional associations could either collectively or individually take much more of an active interest. How's that for starters?
Thank you.
Len, in my own career, just add to what's being said here, as a statistician, I marveled at how people with no statistical background or any kind of quantitative skills at all would end up as my manager and team leader. And then I would see them moving up into the executives, highly paid executive and influential executive roles in various organizations. And I wonder how that happened. There is, in a statistical sense anyway, an overall lowering of capability in the public service over the last 15 or 20 years. And I think that's regrettable.
And I think what you do with that is each generation of young statisticians, when they become branch heads, you send them off to a management school. When they get a little higher, you send them off to a higher management school, and you keep treating them. It's the same in the health sector. You know, we've got a medical profession that the moment you become a chief medical officer in a DHB, the belief is that you don't know anything about medicine anymore because you're only practicing half-time. And I think we have to really lift our investment. You know, the so-called generic managers get to go to the course. I went to Fontainebleau. I've been to INSEAD because in my generation, there was an investment regardless of your background. And I think we've lost that plot. We need to take, whether you're a good scientist, even if you're only going to run a field of change, you still need to know enough about that, have those competencies.
Kia ora, thanks. I think in line with this entire, the last few questions, this idea that you had about accountability, I think, is quite interesting because a lot of this information is given to the government. And I just feel like they're not necessarily, they don't need to be accountable anymore, a lot of them. A lot of the times they just go in there, the slogans, the stereotypes, those things that you mentioned, they get in there. We've shifted from evidence-informed to evidence-led to evidence-informed. And I'm just like, there's no consequence after they are out of office and they've done a bunch of damage by not listening or reading the information that we've been giving them or cherry picking the information that we give them. It's all ideologically driven. The stats aren't making enough of a case. And maybe that's because it's just quantitative. Where are the stories behind the quantitative? And I don't know, it's not even a question really, but.
I can offer a bias. In my view, much of that came about for two reasons. One is the rise of the generic policy analysts who have replaced many of the research units. You know, in the 70s and 80s, departments like social welfare, health, justice, education had world-leading, scientifically strong research centres. And many of those places have been turned into policy groups. Also, the idea of a operations split of operations from policy has meant that we have policy analysts that don't necessarily ever go out in the streets or sit with the communities that are actually interacting with what they do. And so, and yet in virtually every sector of public activity, it's the on-the-ground reaction. You know, if you look at homelessness, for example, it's really an interesting mix of housing, health, justice. Yet we manage it with individual departments looking at it. My old friend John Angus, when he was Children's Commissioner, or left that job, he made the point that the difficulty with policy with respect to children, that Oranga Tamariki thinks that it actually manages everything to do with children and care, but they forget that for every child they take, grandmothers take two. And I think we're often a bit weak in understanding the perch that a government agency can actually have compared to the totality of what's done. And that's why, you know, look at school lunches, good heavens. It must be the most brilliant graphic example of exactly the sort of stupidity that you're talking about. How many communities managed an unusual and almost irreplaceable mix between business, volunteer work, and people in schools themselves adjusting, and now we've replaced that with a sort of internationally flown, God knows when prepared bits of tucker that come along. And who would want to have 650,000 kids with access to social media reporting on what you produce, even if you were doing a brilliant job? My God, you know, that must be the height of political madness. Anyway, I'm, as an independent observer, of course.
I think we have time.
Thanks very much, Len, and I wondered if I could get one more bias out of you. Besides all the policy research and things and surveys that you've been talking about, there's a huge mass of commercial and social research done around New Zealand every day, which is based on things like defining quotas or sample designs, or even, you know, the membership of the number of people that we should have in focus groups when we study anything. And all of those decisions about designs are based on, usually on census data. If you think that the last two censuses have had problems, which I think you do, then do you think that a whole lot of this other mass of social and other research that well-meaning market researchers and social researchers are doing might be also becoming more and more problematic?
My cheeky comment would be no more now than before. I remember many years ago, one of our major market research companies ran a survey, a quota sample survey of the wealth of older people.
Right.
And I got into deep trouble because I was at a conference and I said the survey design is rather tatty and won't do the job. And I had to sit with the Minister of Statistics at the time and this market research company and explain that my wording had been inappropriate, but so was their survey design. But I learned from then on, never use the word tatty. No, I think that's the great advantage of the British Statistics Authority, where there is another body that can tackle ministers, those type of organisations, and say your work's not good enough. It's hard after a while for a government statistician. I used to argue that I could challenge ministers maybe 3 or 4 times a year, but if I did it 10 times, I was going to be demonstrating a certain amount of uselessness. And I think you need to have that capacity. Challenging the quality of information that's produced is a really important thing to do in a society, but I do think there's a limit to what a government statistician himself or herself can do.
I guess I'm asking you, not just, we can have the argument about quota surveys being bad, obviously, but if the quotas themselves are completely wrong, because the census they're based on is completely wrong, and we're going from not very good to appalling.
We're often getting, the advantage of the way we salvaged the 18 census and we did by bringing in the IDI, we managed to maintain those basic distributions. It's just that we can't analyse the ethnicity of the population. We have no family statistics. It's worth having an household. But the age distribution analysis would be pretty much as useful, and that's mainly what those quota samples.
And ethnicity.
Yeah.
Len, so we can go forward. How do you see that either the professionals that you've mentioned that are also on those advisory committees, or even the more informed public, can work together to see that the politicians, or even some of the CEs that have to carry out what they want, are able to look past the 3 or 4 year term and do a whole of life parliament thing for 10 years or so, using evidence-based information?
In some ways, it's like I chaired the board of Subaru, and when that went down the tubes, David Preston did a review for us of the loss of every evaluation agency since 1935, and he called it "For Whom the Bell Tolls," because in terms of evaluation, we have got a capacity, both Labor and National, to ditch evaluation agencies. They sort of have a short half-life. And I think that generally, I would say official statisticians don't get affected by that quite as much. What you find in official statistics is about once every 10, 15 years, someone will want to give you some money, but the intervening 14 years, they want to take it off you. And that sort of is the broader context you operate in. But it seems to me that the hard thing is getting people to value what you produce. So, for example, as I mentioned, during the late 80s, when we had all this issue of debt, macroeconomic failings, there was a real interest in economic statistics. I doubt whether there'll be anyone in Parliament in the last decade that would have much interest in any statistics. I mean, I'm optimistic that Dr. Retty, being a scientist, will have a bit more interest. The last Minister of Statistics we had that had any scientific background was Maurice Williamson. And I think that it's unfortunate the statistics is seen as a portfolio to become a residual one. And yet, to me, the Minister of Statistics is a minister for all Parliament, not just the party, because statistics have to be universally accepted. And generally, I'd say my experience and observations are that New Zealand has been free of political bias in what we do, but what we haven't been free from is just plain ignorance.
Thank you. We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. We have somebody here, we have somebody there. That makes 3 questions.
Kia ora, Len, and I like to feel that the popularity of the seminar reflects the manner in which we hold your views. Thank you for being here. I've got 2 questions I'd like to ask. I suppose it's not here. The first is to context the second. If you could cast your mind back 30 years, and there's someone there who has equal mana in that age, who's come to give a seminar like this, would the demographic of the audience have been much different? That's the context-setting question. The next one is that I would suggest, I'd like your views please, on whether part of the future as we go forward is to change, is that it needs to be a cultural change within our society before we're ready to adopt some of these suggestions you've got for the way we approach statistics.
Firstly, I think 30 years ago there would have been a younger audience. Well, there would have been a spread. The spread would be very different, and it would be a much larger share of the audience would be in their 30s or younger. In terms of the potential for change, well, the British had massive problems with their statistics. In the late Thatcher years, there was a review by a guy, Rayner, who basically said the British government should only produce statistics that are of immediate value to government policy. That caused quite a lot of damage. They had a very traumatic 80s. Then in the early 90s, they started thinking of how do they lift the game. They brought over an Australian statistician Australian chief statistician, to be the chief statistician of the United Kingdom in '92. When he left, he was then replaced by the leading British professor of statistics in Southampton, Tim Holt. And then when Tim retired, I got the job. And so they and they also introduced this concept of national statistics, because previously the legislation was based on the 1948 Statistics of Trade Act and the 1920 Census Act. And so they really upgraded. So the British, I would say in 2007, their legislation was amongst the most leading in the world. One of my colleagues, Australian, actually said, "This is terrible, it's awful. You know, how can you have a body?" And I said, "Yeah, this is great. You know, when you've been there, you need to have critical friends. In something like statistics, it's your critical friends who will tell you you're talking rubbish or your statistics are rubbish, but we need them." And I think that's something that the Statistics Office itself plays a part in, but you have to have a political context. We had a National Development Conference in 1969. There was a comprehensive technical committee on statistics, which was really a blueprint for official statistics for 2 decades. And that was because during the National Development Conference in the late 60s, people realised you need good statistics. So the Department of Stats went from being 300 people using mainly administrative data, to having within 10 years the resources to manage a massive household and business survey capability. Its staff went from 300 to 720. It ended up with a very strong professional statistical capability rather than a small number of really bright people. And so it built up the critical mass. That's happened to us once, and it happened to Britain. And I'm quite strongly of the view that I don't know what it is that tips things over. They're going the other direction. We've lost our applied maths division, which to my view was a really integral part of scientific statistical capability in New Zealand. All of us in statistics knew where they were. All of us would have hassled someone there at some stage. This was the brains of New Zealand statistics, apart from the universities. In fact, they were one floor below Victoria University's statistics group. So I think that capability can be developed, but you've got to find someone, both a political and a bureaucratic consensus.
We're going to have to close up fairly shortly. I'm reluctant to allow one last question, but I'm going to allow one last question, and then we will close up. Yes.
Thanks, Len. Something that you haven't touched on in your talk tonight, the ethics underpinning statistical confidentiality. Now, the 1975 Statistics Act, well, it's quite strong on that. And of course, back in 1975, when I joined the department, the whole place was buzzing, people were enthusiastic, they had new legislation. Now, the legislation which has replaced the 1975 Act, which I can't recall the full name of, it's something to do with information and data, does it still have the same underpinning concern with statistical confidentiality, particularly as we start using more and more admin data rather than data collected solely for statistical purposes by the government statistician and its staff acting under a strict confidentiality regime? You might like to comment on that, please. Thank you.
Having commented on the data and statistics bill when it was built, I think the confidentiality clauses themselves are very strong and pretty much the same. They express slightly differently. My concern with it, by the way, was that the government statistician could delegate the role of the government statistician to any number of unnamed persons without qualification, which I thought was a complete abomination of an important independent role, as did Sir Geoffrey Palmer and Maurice Williamson agree with me when we had a go at a rather deaf select committee. I think that the official statisticians, as you know from your time there, were innately quite protective of confidentiality. The Irish chief statistician once said that official statisticians spend half their life collecting data and the other half stopping them get at it. In New Zealand, by official statistical office standards, is generally very, very conservative. For example, I used to approve every microdata access. When I went to Britain, we had 10,000 microdata accesses each year, all proved by a very strong protocol, but several people approved it. And we had a director level committee that develop new approaches. And we had one occasion, 1 year, where someone misused data, took away raw records from our business directory, and I simply banned them for using the system for 10 years and wrote to his Vice Chancellor and said, if anyone else from your university does the same thing, then we might ban the university. So that was, in both countries, we took confidentiality. And I think, can I give you another example? In 2001, we added religion to the British census because we had ethnicity in the previous census and we wanted to understand the different social groups more. We were going to release our religious data at the same time as George Bush decided to go and bomb Iraq. And for the following few months after that, you might recall that in the United States and then in Britain, anyone wearing a turban of any sort was getting beaten up, and there were some rather disastrous biases. So basically, what I did before we released it, I got every religious community in Britain together for a room, and I said, look, you can trust us with respect to confidentiality. In fact, most people think we do too much, but when it comes to privacy, we really know nothing more than you. And so there are group privacy issues that we cannot understand that affect you on the day. And all of those communities said, look, we'd rather have the data. We want to know who our communities are, give us the data, and we will manage that. But they needed to know that we actually took, even if we were going to be ill-informed or not very capable on privacy, we were still absolutely staunch on confidentiality. And I think that's where some of the tension is, James, in your point, and you should never expect official statisticians to be more societally conscious than anyone else in the community.
Thank you, and this really brings us to a close, but I will just mention that on the Wednesday, the 2nd of April, in this very room at 6 p.m, we have Professor Aotearoa Chanturia, and I've spoken with her. I think she's from Belarus. Professor Aotearoa Chanturia, she's a linguist, and she'll tell us why we say things like fast food, when the phrase quick meal would do just as well, why we say bride and groom instead of groom and bride, and the historic origins of common phrases in the English language. 2nd of April, Wednesday at 6 p.m. in this very room. We look forward to seeing you. And thank you once again, Len, for an enthralling and very informative lecture. Thank you.